The beam of my flashlight cut a swathe through the inky blackness, the familiar circle of light a small comfort against the vast, indifferent woods. Tonight, the Blackwood section of the Chippewa National Forest felt heavier than usual, the silence between the rustling leaves and snapping twigs almost oppressive. It was late, well past midnight, and the usual nocturnal symphony of the forest was muted, almost hesitant. I'd been a ranger here for 15 years. I knew the language of these woods like my own. The sharp bark of a fox, the drumming wings of a startled grouse, the contented chirps of crickets. Tonight, though, the forest seemed to be speaking a different dialect, one I couldn't quite place. It started subtly, a distant hoot that seemed a touch too resonant, the notes lingering in the still air for a fraction too long. Great horned owls were common enough, their calls usually a reassuring presence in the darkness. But this one, it felt amplified, almost theatrical. I paused, my hand instinctively resting on the radio clip to my belt. Just an owl, I told myself, probably perched on a particularly hollow branch. I continued my patrol, the crunch of my boots on the fallen leaves the only sound I made. Then a new voice joined the night. A coyote's howl, rising and falling with its characteristic mournful cadence. Again, nothing unusual, except this howl possessed a strange clarity, as if the animal were much closer than it sounded. And there was a subtle echo, faint doubling of the sound that shouldn't have been there in the still night air. A prickle of unease began to crawl up my spine. Coyotes were present in Blackwood, but they rarely ventured this deep, preferring the edges of the forest. And that echo, it was like the sound was bouncing off something unseen, something unnatural. I stopped again, switching off my flashlight and letting my ears become my primary sense. The silence rushed back in, thick and expectant. Then it came, a deer's bleat. It was close, very close, and laced with a raw, unmistakable distress. The kind of sound a fawn makes when separated from its mother, or an adult deer makes in its final moments. My training kicked in. A distressed deer this deep in the woods at this hour could mean a predator was nearby, possibly a bear or a pack of wolves. I reached for my bear spray, my heart beginning to thump a little faster. But something felt wrong. The bleat didn't sound quite right. It was too perfect, too sustained, lacking the frantic, broken quality of genuine fear. It was like an imitation. The thought sent a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool night air. I switched my flashlight back on, its beam jittering slightly as my hand trembled. I scanned the surrounding trees, the dense undergrowth, but saw nothing. No glint of eyes, no rustling of a large animal, just the silent, watchful trees. Then the owl hooted again, closer this time, and the coyote howled in response, the unnatural echo even more pronounced. The deer bleated again, the sound now tinged with a subtle, almost mocking quality. It was a conversation, a twisted three-part harmony of the forest, but one that felt profoundly wrong. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Could it be another animal, one I wasn't familiar with, that had learned to mimic these sounds? It seemed impossible. The precision, the subtle nuances of each call, it felt deliberate, intentional. A disturbed individual? Someone out in the woods, playing cruel tricks? The thought offered a sliver of comfort, a human explanation for the unsettling sounds. But the sheer perfection of the mimicry, the way the calls seemed to be drawing me deeper into the woods, argued against it. I took a step back, my senses on high alert. The calls continued, each one a carefully crafted lure. The owl's hoot was now impossibly close, seeming to emanate from just beyond the reach of my flashlight beam. The coyote's howl circled me, the echo creating a disorienting sense of being surrounded. And the deer's bleat, it sounded directly behind me. I whirled around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there. Just the dense wall of trees, their shadows stretching and swaying in the faint breeze. Paranoia began to take root, twisting my perception of the familiar woods. Every rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps, every snap of a twig like a deliberate approach. The silence between the calls was no longer empty, charged, expectant. I felt like I was being watched, studied, by something that understood the language of the forest better than I did. I started to move, slowly at first, then with increasing urgency, back the way I had come. The calls followed, maintaining their distance, always just out of sight, just out of reach. The owl hooted from my left, the coyote howled from my right, and the deer bleated somewhere behind me, urging me onward, deeper into the black heart of Blackwood. I tried to rationalize. Stress, exhaustion, the tricks the darkness could play on the mind. But the clarity of the sounds, their unnerving perfection, defied any logical explanation. This wasn't the random noise of the forest. It was a carefully orchestrated performance, and I was the unwilling audience. The feeling of being hunted intensified. Not by a predator seeking a meal, but by something else. Something that seemed to be toying with me, leading me on a macabre chase through the darkness. I broke into a run, my breath coming in ragged gasps, the beam of my flashlight bouncing wildly. The calls kept pace, their rhythm quickening, their tone becoming more insistent. The owl's hoot now had a sharp, almost impatient edge, the coyote's howl a triumphant note, and the deer's bleat. It sounded like a sob, a lure designed to prey on my empathy, my instinct to protect. I stumbled, catching myself on a low-hanging branch. For a moment, the calls stopped, and a profound silence descended. I stood there, panting, listening, my heart pounding in my chest. Had it gone? Was it over? Then, the silence was broken by a new sound. It was faint at first, a low, guttural hum that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath my feet. It grew steadily louder, a resonant drone that had no earthly origin. It wasn't the growl of an animal, nor the sound of machinery. It was something else, something ancient and unsettling. The familiar calls resumed, but now they were layered over the humming, distorted and twisted into something truly horrifying. The owl's hoot became a drawn-out, mournful wail, the coyote's howl a series of sharp guttural barks, and the deer's bleat a high-pitched, piercing shriek. I didn't understand what was happening, but a primal fear gripped me. This was no longer a game. It was something far more sinister. My carefully constructed reality, my understanding of the natural world, was crumbling around me. I turned and ran, not towards my truck, not towards safety, but blindly, desperately, through the trees, the unnatural symphony of the forest pursuing me into the endless night. I didn't know what awaited me in the darkness, but I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I no longer understood the language of these woods. And whatever did was calling my name. The path had dissolved some time ago, the forest floor yielding to a carpet of moss, so thick it felt like walking on a lung. The air hung heavy, not with humidity, but with a silence that swallowed sound before it could truly form. Sunlight filtered through the dense canopy in fractured emerald shards, illuminating dust motes that danced with an unnerving stillness. This part of the Redwood National Park was a palimpsest of forgotten time, marked on no maps, whispered about only in the oldest ranger lore. Then, through a veil of ancient ferns, it appeared. Not a sudden revelation, but a gradual coalescing of shadow and line into something undeniably structured. It was a cabin, or what remained of one. Its timbers, bleached silver by countless seasons, leaned against each other like weary mourners. The roof had long since surrendered to the elements, leaving the interior open to the sky, a square of bruised twilight framed by decaying wood. An instinct, older than my training, drew me forward. The air around the structure hummed with a faint, almost imperceptible vibration. It wasn't a sound, but a feeling, a resonance in the bones. Stepping over the threshold where a door might once have hung was like crossing into another stratum of reality. The moss underfoot inside was a deeper green, almost phosphorescent. Strange symbols were etched into the remaining wall panels, spirals that seemed to writhe, angular lines that intersected in unsettling ways, and circles enclosing what looked like eyes, all carved with a precision that belied the cabin's decay. They weren't familiar glyphs, nothing I'd ever seen in any anthropological text. They pulsed faintly in my peripheral vision, as if imbued with a residual energy. Scattered on the earthen floor were remnants of a life abruptly interrupted. A tarnished silver locket lay open, revealing 2 miniature portraits. Faces blurred with time, their expressions unreadable yet hinting at a profound sorrow. Beside it, a child's wooden toy, a crude carving of a bird with one wing broken, rested on its side. A heavy leather-bound book lay open, its pages filled with a script I couldn't decipher. The ink faded to a sepia that seemed to bleed into the fibers of the paper. The air within the cabin held the faint, lingering scent of wood smoke and something else. Something metallic, like old blood, or perhaps just the rust of time. As I knelt to examine the locket, a shadow flickered at the edge of my vision. I turned sharply, but there was nothing there. Just the play of the fractured sunlight through the gaps in the walls. But the feeling persisted, a sense of being observed, not by something living, but by the very fabric of the place itself. I reached out to touch the wooden bird, and a low hum filled the air. So subtle it was more a pressure against my eardrums than an audible sound. The symbols on the walls seemed to deepen, their lines growing sharper. The portraits in the locket appeared to shift, the blurred faces momentarily resolving into expressions of stark terror before dissolving back into indistinctness. The boundary between observation and participation began to blur. I felt a pull, a subtle coercion to understand, to piece together the story held within these decaying walls. It wasn't a rational curiosity, but a deeper, almost instinctual urge. Moving deeper into the cabin's embrace, I noticed a dark opening in the far wall, low to the ground. It looked like the entrance to a root cellar, or perhaps something more subterranean. A cold draft emanated from it, carrying a scent of damp earth and something else, something sweet and cloying, like overripe fruit on the verge of decay. As I approached the opening, the humming intensified, and the shadows within seemed to wreathe and coalesce into vague, unsettling shapes. I had no logical reason to venture into that darkness, but my feet moved of their own accord, drawn by an invisible thread. The passage descended into a suffocating blackness. My flashlight beam revealed rough-hewn walls, slick with moisture, and the air grew heavy, pressing against my chest. The humming resonated in my skull, and the sweet, cloying scent intensified, becoming almost nauseating. Then I saw them. Not clearly, but as fleeting impressions caught at the periphery of my vision. Figures, vaguely human in shape, pressed against the walls, their forms flickering like heat haze. They didn't move, didn't make a sound, but their presence was palpable, a silent, oppressive weight. I tried to speak, to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. A feeling of profound dread washed over me, not a fear of immediate danger, but a deeper, more primal terror of the unknown, of something fundamentally alien. The passage opened into a larger chamber, the darkness here absolute. My flashlight beam danced across the rough-hewn walls, revealing nothing concrete, only the shifting play of light and shadow that seemed to take on grotesque and fleeting forms. The humming was now a deafening drone, and the sweet, cloying scent was almost unbearable. Then, the floor beneath my feet began to vibrate. Not violently, but with a subtle, rhythmic pulse, like a giant, unseen heart beating beneath the earth. The air grew thick, viscous, and I felt a pressure building within me, a sense of something trying to surface to be expressed. I looked down at my hands, and they seemed to shimmer, the skin becoming translucent, revealing a network of faint, glowing lines beneath. The symbols I had seen on the cabin walls seemed to be replicating themselves on my skin, intricate patterns of light that pulsed in time with the vibrations in the floor. The boundaries of my own body began to dissolve, the edges of my perception blurring. I felt myself expanding, merging with the darkness, with the humming, with the silent, unseen presence in the chamber. The memories of the cabin, the locket, the bird, the book, all swirled within me, not as separate objects, but as fragments of a unified, incomprehensible whole. There was no narrative here, no linear progression of events, only a deepening immersion into a state of pure sensation, a formless dread and a sense of profound, unknowable loss. The experience wasn't terrifying in a conventional sense. It was more unsettling, a glimpse into a reality that operated on entirely different principles, where logic and reason held no sway. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it started to recede. The humming softened, the vibrations subsided, the glowing lines on my hands faded. The fleeting shapes in the darkness dissolved back into shadow. I found myself back in the passage, the air still heavy, but the oppressive presence lessened. I stumbled back towards the cabin, my limbs feeling heavy and unresponsive. Emerging back into the fractured sunlight felt like waking from a deep, troubled sleep. The cabin stood silent, its decaying timbers casting long, skeletal shadows. The symbols on the walls seemed less vibrant, the scattered remnants on the floor inert. I looked back at the dark opening in the wall, the entrance to the subterranean chamber, and it seemed smaller now, less inviting. The sweet, cloying scent had dissipated, replaced by the clean, earthy smell of the forest. I left the cabin as I had found it, unmarked and silent, a forgotten relic in the heart of the ancient woods. But something had shifted within me. The familiar world felt subtly altered, the edges of reality less defined. The memory of the humming, the fleeting figures, the glowing symbols, lingered like the residue of a vivid dream, a reminder of a place where the rules of waking life did not apply, and where the silence held secrets that were perhaps best left undisturbed. The forest around me seemed to watch, its ancient trees swaying in a breeze I couldn't feel, their rustling leaves whispering a language I no longer understood. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, a small, defiant orange against the encroaching gray of the late afternoon. Outside the window of the observation post, the familiar symphony of the Redwood Creek watershed had fallen utterly silent. For the past 3 hours, a hush had descended upon this particular stretch of the park, a stillness so profound it felt less like the absence of sound and more like a tangible presence. I've spent 30 years listening to this wilderness. I know the conversational chatter of Steller's jays, the insistent drumming of pileated woodpeckers, the rustling gossip of deer moving through the underbrush. Even in the deepest snows of winter, there's always a whisper of wind, the snap of a frozen branch, the distant call of a raven. But here, now, there was nothing. Not even the sigh of the towering redwoods in the gentle breeze that stirred the leaves just beyond the silent zone. The silence had begun subtly, almost imperceptibly. A gradual fading of the usual background hum. The chattering squirrels had stopped their scolding. The melodious warble of a Swainson's thrush had abruptly cut off mid-phrase. At first, I dismissed it as a natural lull, a momentary pause in the forest's constant monologue. But the stillness had persisted, deepening into this unnerving void. I rose from the worn armchair, the creak of the aged wood strangely loud in the pervasive quiet. The map spread across the sturdy wooden table showed nothing unusual about this particular quadrant. A mature redwood forest, a small creek winding through it, the usual trails marked in thin red lines. No old logging roads, no forgotten structures, nothing to suggest a human influence that could explain this unnatural quietude. I walked to the window, my gaze sweeping across the motionless landscape. The ferns that usually danced in the dappled sunlight hung still, their fronds unmoving. Even the creek, visible as a silver ribbon through the trees, seemed to flow with an unusual languor, its gentle murmur absent. A pair of California quail, usually bustling and vocal, stood frozen at the edge of a clearing, their heads cocked at an unnatural angle, their dark eyes wide and unblinking. They looked like statues, their vibrant plumage stark against the muted greens and browns of the forest floor. After a long suspended moment, they turned abruptly and vanished into the undergrowth, not with a flurry of panicked movement, but with a silent, almost gliding retreat. This wasn't the stillness of peaceful rest. It felt like a holding of breath, an anticipation of something unseen. A prickle of unease traced its way up my spine, a sensation I hadn't felt in years in these familiar woods. I reached for my binoculars, their weight a familiar comfort in my hands. I scanned the canopy, searching for the usual avian activity. Empty branches, silent nests. The air itself seemed devoid of the usual flurry of wings. Lowering the binoculars, my gaze fell upon the forest floor. I noticed a set of deer tracks leading into the silent zone. They were fresh, the sharp indentations in the soft earth clearly visible. But then, abruptly, they stopped. Not as if the deer had bedded down or changed direction, but simply ceased, as if the animal had vanished into thin air. There were no further tracks leading away. A shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature ran through me. It was as if the very act of movement, of leaving a trace, was somehow inhibited within this silent space. I stepped out onto the small porch of the observation post, the wooden planks solid beneath my boots, the silence pressed in, palpable weight against my eardrums. I took a deep breath, expecting the familiar scent of damp earth and redwood needles, but the air here was strangely neutral, almost sterile. A single leaf detached from a high branch and fell, spiraling down in slow motion. It landed on the mossy ground without a sound, as if even gravity had been muted within this strange pocket of stillness. I walked a few steps away from the post, venturing into the edge of the silent zone. The transition was subtle but distinct. One moment, the distant rush of a waterfall further down the creek was faintly audible. The next, it was gone, swallowed by the all-encompassing hush. I knelt down, examining the vegetation at close range. The leaves felt strangely cool to the touch, almost unnaturally still. There was no subtle tremor of life, no tiny insect crawling across a blade of grass, no spiderweb shimmering in the faint light. It was as if all the small, unseen dramas of the forest had been suspended. A deadfall, a large redwood branch that had crashed to the ground weeks ago, lay partially within the silent zone and partially outside. The portion within the silence was covered in a strange pale moss I hadn't seen before, its texture almost velvety. The portion outside bore the familiar rough bark and decaying needles. The line of demarcation was sharp, unnervingly so. The sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows through the silent trees. The air grew cooler, but the usual increase in nocturnal sounds, the chirping of crickets, the first hoot of an owl, did not materialize. The silence remained absolute, a heavy blanket smothering the life of the forest. A feeling of profound unease settled over me, a sense that I was in the presence of something ancient and unknowable. It wasn't a fear of a tangible threat, but a deeper, more unsettling awareness of a fundamental wrongness, a disruption of the natural order. I thought of old legends, whispered tales of places in the deep woods that were avoided by animals, places where the very air felt wrong. I had always dismissed them as folklore, the fanciful imaginings of lonely nights. Standing here in this unnatural stillness, a seed of doubt began to sprout. I retreated back to the observation post, the small cabin feeling like a fragile island in a sea of silence. The fire in the hearth had died down to glowing embers, casting flickering shadows on the wooden walls. I added more fuel, the crackling of the dry wood a jarring sound in the surrounding quiet. As darkness deepened, the silence seemed to intensify, pressing against the windows, a tangible force. I sat by the fire, listening to the sound of my own breathing, the beating of my own heart, amplified in the unnatural stillness. Outside, the moon rose, a pale disk in the inky sky, casting an eerie silver light over the silent forest. I knew I should report this, call it in. But what would I say? There's a patch of woods that's too quiet. There were no signs of fire, no evidence of human interference, no obvious cause for this pervasive stillness. I stayed there through the long, silent night, the feeling of unease growing with the darkness. Just before dawn, as a faint gray light began to filter through the trees, a single bird called out, far in the distance. It was a lone hermit thrush, its song a hesitant, questioning melody. Then another joined in, and another. Gradually, tentatively, the sounds of the forest began to return, like a symphony orchestra slowly tuning up after a long intermission. By sunrise, the silence was gone, replaced by the familiar chorus of the awakening woods. The quail had moved on, their tracks leading away from the silent zone. The deer tracks remained, ending abruptly as before. The strange, pale moss on the deadfall seemed less vibrant in the daylight. I walked back to the edge of the area where the silence had held sway. The transition was once again subtle, a gradual increase in the density of sound. The feeling of profound unease began to dissipate, replaced by a lingering sense of bewilderment. I never found an explanation for the silence. The maps showed nothing. My reports were met with polite skepticism. But I knew what I had experienced. I had stood in a place where the very essence of life seemed to have been momentarily suspended. A place where the forest held its breath for reasons unknown. And sometimes, even now, when the wind whispers through the redwoods and the familiar sounds of the wilderness surround me, I remember the profound and unsettling stillness, and I listen a little more closely to the spaces between the sounds.